On the evening before the wedding, the house was silent, as if before a storm. On the table lay a small walnut box, smelling of wax and laurel, its edges worn smooth by the hands of women who had passed it down from generation to generation. On the lid was a faintly faded picture of a grapevine. Everyone knew that inside lay things that were not considered part of the dowry: personal letters, a comb, a couple of coins for emergencies, a string of coral beads. And yet, that evening, the box became the subject of a heated dispute. The groom demanded the key, citing family tradition. The notary, summoned in advance by the bride's cautious aunt, opened the folder with ink and wax. From that moment on, the cozy kitchen turned into a place where myths were tested with paper. Hello, friends. This is a man's voice, attentive to the details of the story. Write in the comments which city and country you are listening to this analysis from, and what your families called custom and what they called law. It is important for me to see a map of your observations. Make yourself comfortable, pour yourself some warm tea or water, and let this story be a calm but firm guide through the troubled pages of the past. Enjoy listening. In that story, recorded in the notarial book of a northern city in the Archbishop's metropolis in the last quarter of the 14th century, there is not a single direct reply, only dates in words, names, lists of items, and reservations. It is not someone's hot blood that rules here, but the cold order of lines. The city stands at the crossroads of merchant routes, dependent on grain coming from the south and dried fish coming from the coast. For several years in a row, northern storms have been battering the docks, and a new line about insurance premiums has appeared in the Merchant Guild's charter. On the neighboring pages, one can read about the rights of widows to trade stalls and how to inventory the property of those leaving for distant fairs. These pages are important not only for trade. They show how the city learned to record the fine line between the public and the private. The bride in this record is an adult woman, the daughter of a tanner, with her own craft skills, confirmed by a mark from the workshop foreman. She knew how to bleach and polish thin leather for bookbinding. This is an extremely important detail. She had her own tools, recorded as her property, not as part of her father's household. The groom is an apprentice from a family that has boasted of strict house rules for many years. In their home, they said that it was customary for everything brought into the house to be subject to the head of the household. Such stories are often repeated at weddings, alongside pies and cups. But on the notary's table lies another world: dried parchment leather, seals, statutes, collections of city ordinances under carved wooden covers. In recent years, the Archbishop's office has repeatedly reminded people that marriage contracts must clearly distinguish between dowry and personal belongings, and that boxes with small valuables, jewelry, and letters belong to the woman, unless the contract says otherwise. This is not a matter of mercy or fashion, but a response to dozens of conflicts where personal property was mixed with common property and used as a lever of pressure. The groom's family came to the discussion in advance and brought their examples. They listed stories where, allegedly, women handed over the keys to their boxes before the first week of living together, considering it a sign of trust. The notary, an aging man with ink under his fingernails, kept a collection of city court decisions from the last decade at hand. There, you can read about several cases where relatives demanded access to women's personal belongings after a broken engagement or after a quarrel, hiding behind tales of ancient customs. In most cases, the judges separated the legends from the rules and fined those who tried to forcibly remove personal items from chests and boxes. But legends are tenacious. They are convenient for those who benefit from blurring the boundaries. A separate page in this case is the inventory. The notary requires accurate lists. The dowry includes bed linen, 1 silver cup, some fabric that the father bought at a fair in late spring, and a share in the shop, a quarter of the proceeds, confirmed in writing and stamped by the village elder. Personal items are listed separately: a box with a bone comb, a string of coral, several coins collected from the bride's earnings, a small icon, scissors, a bone needle, 2 parchment scrolls with records of orders and expenses. It is worth noting that these records were kept in her own hand and are considered a document of her work. It seems dry, but it is precisely this dryness that saves her from arbitrariness. When the conversation about custom reaches a boiling point, the notary asks for written confirmation. The groom's family brings 3 certificates, found, as they say, at a friend's scribe. Upon closer inspection, it turns out that 2 of the documents relate to neighboring lands under a different legal system, where the family's power over women is even stronger, and where there is no tradition of urban contracts. And the 3rd certificate is from a different era altogether, dated a decade earlier, and concerns a widow's share, not the girl's personal property. There are no city council seals in the margins of these papers, no marks from the notaries of this curia. These papers resemble sheets of private instructions, often rewritten and retold in homes, but from the point of view of city practice, they are empty. This is the first crack in a myth that long seemed monolithic. While the parties are arguing, 2 members of the Bookbinders' Craft Guild enter the room. They have come not at the family's request, but out of duty. In recent years, the guild has taken on the role of witness in disputes over labor-related matters. Their task is to confirm that tools and work records are not decorations or ladies' whims, but part of the craftsmanship on which their livelihood depends. They check the scissors, look at the sewing needle and the leather thimble, and read the records of orders for 2 offices and a monastery library. These people are not inclined towards high style. They are interested in size, quantity, condition, and most importantly, origin. They confirm that the items were purchased and used by the woman herself for her work, and were not given to her as a gift to be displayed at her wedding. This means that she brings not only a dowry to her marriage, but also professional autonomy. And it is her box that is not only a container of sentimental items, but also one that is important for survival. It also contains records of payments and debtors, which may come in handy if one of the customers decides not to pay. The city curia has already dealt with similar cases, and there is a special clause in the collection of ordinances of recent years. Personal valuables and professional records stored in small chests are not subject to automatic appropriation by the spouse. It also states that any interference without the owner's consent is considered a violation of the peace of the home and is punishable by a fine. This fine varies from district to district, because each district at one time took separate measures against night searches, which were practiced by some families who considered themselves above city law. According to the records in the penalty books, such interventions were often accompanied by domestic violence and humiliation. These details are not described in vivid detail in the documents, only dry notes about bruises, broken locks, and crying neighbors who heard the noise. The city did not like to write about pain, but it recorded the traces from which the punishment tariff was derived. One thing is important here. The box is not a symbol of romantic mystery, but a boundary that cannot be crossed by habit. The groom's family, unwilling to back down, tries to turn the dispute into a matter of honor and reputation. They argue that refusing to hand over the key will look like mistrust and will ruin the relationship between the families. In a city where rumors spread faster than merchant carts, fear of reputation is stronger than many laws. But the notary's book knows ways to stop fear. It offers the language of reservations. The notary unfolds the sheet, where the text of the contract is already outlined, and adds the following lines. The personal box remains at the full disposal of the wife. Access to its contents is possible only with her consent, expressed in writing in the presence of witnesses. In case of an attempt to open it without consent, a fine, determined by the quarterly charter, in favor of the city treasury, with the addition of compensation to the woman. This is not a moral lecture, but an administrative mechanism. It is based on the fact that the city dislikes private initiative, which gives rise to general instability more than anything else. While the ink is drying, another layer of pressure is revealed, one that is rarely written about in textbooks. In a neighboring book of fines, there are records of cases where customary law was used to economically seize personal coins and small jewelry from women in the first weeks of marriage. This money was used to pay off the groom's debts or for risky transactions, and later, in the event of divorce or the death of the husband, was returned to the women only partially or not at all. The city authorities saw this not only as a family issue, but also as a financial problem. The outflow of small savings weakened the ability of families to withstand crop failures and disease. One of the council's decisions states that the habit of demanding access to jewelry boxes undermines the stability of households in winter. This is a serious reason to intervene. The same document provides figures in writing. After a series of decrees, the number of complaints decreased over 3 years, while the number of cases where women brought their coins as collateral for common needs, on the contrary, increased. And this was done with their consent and registration. What seems private is, in fact, the economic architecture of the city. Not everyone agrees with this architecture. In the same neighborhood where our dispute is taking place, there are 2 families who continue to tell their children that a husband's authority over his wife's possessions has been established since ancient times. In conversation, this is often accompanied by references to sermons and thick books that no one opens. When one of these families tried to rely on these words in court, it turned out that the sermons talk about morality and purity, but not about keys and locks, and the thick books talk about inheritance and land management, but not about personal chests. Once again, paper stands against myth. No heroism is needed here, just careful reading. Notaries, quiet people with calloused fingers and eyes red from candle smoke, turn this reading into power. Let's return to the table where the ink is drying. The evening bell rings, and through the thin glass of the window, you can hear people waiting for news talking quietly in the square. It seems that the dispute has become a public spectacle. Strangers are always eager to watch over someone else's border, but the real border is on paper. The notary adds another clause to the contract, born of the complex cases of recent years. In the event of the illness of both spouses or the death of one of them, the key to the box is not to be given to the husband's relatives, but to a female guardian, appointed in advance by the contract itself. For example, the bride's aunt or older sister. This rule appeared after waves of plague, when, following sudden deaths, relatives would rush into houses and take everything they could, hiding behind the pretext of doing good. The city learned its lesson from those years. Chaos destroys trust between neighborhoods, which means trade, which means the treasury. So even a small key, assigned to a specific female guardian, becomes a cog in the wheel of public order. The groom's family, seeing the contract filled with ironclad wording, resorts to threats of breaking off the engagement. These are not empty words. A breakup is a blow to the bride's reputation, even if she remains formally flawless. In a city where survival depends on a network of trust, people avoid working with those whose marriage plans have fallen through, fearing hidden conflicts and debts. But the notary and the council also have a tool for this case. Several years ago, a list of conditions was drawn up under which a breakup due to disagreement with legal stipulations does not entail disgrace. This list hangs in the town hall on a wooden board, next to the measures of length and weight, so that everyone can read it. A woman's refusal to hand over her personal belongings is not considered disrespectful, and an attempt by the groom to exert pressure is an argument against his trustworthiness. The city does not always keep up with the rumors, but it tries. At the same time that our contract was being drawn up, on the other side of town, a paramedic was working at the request of the Curia to collect statistics on injuries related to house searches and customs. His records are grim. He notes bruises, abrasions, nervous breakdowns, insomnia, and next to them, the dry word interference, noting whether there were witnesses. These pages are not for the faint of heart, but they are read not for the sake of horror, but for the sake of understanding how pain is turned into a paper norm. Each line is a small brick in a wall that must stop the next wave. To put it bluntly, abuse of power in family matters existed, and the consequences for women and their loved ones were severe. Lost savings, fear, loss of control over their personal lives. The city chose the tactic of slowly stifling such practices through fines, caveats, systematic records, and public lists. Not everyone understands the power of lists until they see their own name at the bottom of the page with the tariff. When night falls, the notary offers the parties another safeguard, a separate sheet with a promise from both families to respect boundaries in order to prevent sudden late-night visits. This sheet will be kept in the office, and in case of violation, the district sergeant has the right to appear and seal the chests until the case is heard. The sergeant is not a hero of ballads, but he is the figure on whom it depends whether the lock will be broken or not. It should be understood that such measures did not come out of nowhere. Stories circulated in the neighborhoods about nighttime inspections, when a group of relatives, under the guise of caring for the household, would take personal chests to the common room to count and tidy them up. The results of such checks often turned out to be unfavorable for the hostess. In rare cases, priests intervened, reminding people of their responsibilities. But more often than not, the matter remained in a gray area between fear and silence. The city, like an organism, cannot tolerate prolonged inflammation, and therefore prefers to surround the problem with norms until it becomes too cramped. The quiet twist in this story is that the unexpected benefactor for the bride is not a relative or a clergyman, but a guild elder who, upon learning of the dispute, decides to vouch for her professional records. He brings to the office an excerpt from the guild charter, which states that the order books kept by craftsmen and craftswomen are considered part of the guild's document flow and cannot be seized without the permission of the guild master. This is not just a formality. If the groom or his relatives try to take the books, they will face not a private complaint, but a corporate lawsuit that could close their access to the market. Thus, the personal box receives an additional shield, not only a marriage contract, but also guild discipline. The city knows how to strengthen the weak with several layers. Meanwhile, the groom's family tries to revive the myth by telling the story of a great-grandmother who allegedly gave away the key and lived a long life in harmony. But the notary's book responds to myths with statistics. Time after time, the clerk digs up old cases and writes up short reports. Where personal stuff got mixed up with shared stuff without any rules, there were more fights over inheritance because it was impossible to tell what belonged to the woman and what belonged to the house. There were also more frequent records of secret sales of jewelry, which the woman would find out about after the fact. These notes are placed on the table next to the box and make you look at the keyhole differently. It becomes a symbol of risk management rather than secrecy. There is another layer of context that is invisible in family conversations, but clearly visible in city records. After the latest epidemics, the authorities tightened the rules for storing personal items in homes, especially those related to hygiene and care. Boxes often contained medicinal ointments, cloth bandages, needles and thread for treating wounds, and small bottles of tinctures. During outbreaks of disease, it was often women who became the keepers of these kits. Interfering with their boxes meant interfering with the family's preparedness for illness. Therefore, The new ordinances contain a line that seems strange at first glance about the inviolability of small boxes with care items. It sounds like a trivial household matter, but in urban logic, it is a means of preventing panic and unnecessary deaths. When you know that the necessary ointment is on the shelf, you are less likely to run to the store and bring home rumors. To summarize, the first part of this case shows not a resounding victory of one over the other, but the persistent work of form against imaginary content. The custom of the clan, which people like to quote as eternal truth, often turns out to be a collection of convenient stories gathered from neighboring lands and old scrolls without seals. The document, on the contrary, is modest and quiet. It breathes dust, but it stands firm. The box remains on the table, the key in the hand of an adult woman, the pen in the fingers of a notary, and nearby are two witnesses from the guild, ready to sign that the personal is not a trifle or a whim, but the basis of stability. In such cases, the city resembles a large mechanism with springs and gears. If you remove a small pin, everything will creak. That is why it protects the pins. By the time we finish reading this page, the ink will have dried and a seal will be stamped on top. There are a few lines left, about fines, about the possibilities of appeal, about the procedure for storing duplicate keys with a trusted person. These lines will not sing, but they are the city's song about freedom in small things. And if tomorrow, in the square, someone again tells the tale that everything in a man's house is his, it is worth going not to the bench with the loudmouths, but to the office, where thick books explain in simple words, what is yours, as long as it is recorded, certified, and protected by your neighbors. History does not like empty spaces. Where once there was the terrible shadow of custom, now there is a clear table. Dowry, here; personal property, here; access, only with consent; violation, fine. And the drier this table is, the fewer screams there will be at night, and the calmer the first morning after the wedding will be. The next morning, the contract was still lying in the office under the press, which meant that the city machine had not finished its work. The clerk hurriedly noted new references to ordinances in the margins, as if he were attaching a whole network to a single sheet. He made a note in the margins about the quarterly charter, which several years ago had stipulated responsibility for attempts to open personal chests without the owner's consent. The same document specified the amount of the fine in words and the procedure for transferring the money to the treasury. The dry lines formed a dense framework into which it was difficult to insert someone else's legend. In the next room, the head of the Bookbinders Guild waited, rubbing the veins on his palms, and from time to time glancing at the door, behind which the scribe's shadow glided silently, a sign that new papers might be placed on the table. The city did not like haste, but it also did not tolerate unfinished business. If a void was left, it would immediately be filled with myth. By noon, 2 representatives of the neighborhood council had arrived. They were not there for show. In recent years, since the city had been ravaged by successive waves of disease and famine, neighborhood councils had been given the right to participate in establishing the standards of living on which the stability of the courtyards depended. Where locks were broken and personal belongings were taken, clashes were more likely to occur, and these clashes resulted not only in bruises, but also in the spread of rumors that divided neighborhoods into warring factions. The councilors came with a register of violations from the past few winters, and in this register, the same formula was repeated: interference in personal belongings under the guise of custom. Opposite the groom's surname was a previous mark of punishment from several years ago for nighttime inspection of his cousin's chest under the pretext of tidying up. At that time, the relatives hushed up the matter by paying compensation and promising that it would not happen again. This line did not scream or catch the eye, but now, attached to the marriage case, It became a stone that changed the balance of weight. The groom's family, seeing the old mark, tried to steer the conversation back to the usual parables about the dignity of the head of the household. But in recent years, the city office had learned to counter parables with chains. The clerk opened the book of decisions of the ecclesiastical court, which dealt with family disputes in those parts, and found written instructions where the late archbishop, who had survived 2 harsh winters and a plague-ridden autumn, demanded that the small property of wives be taken into account, especially that which was related to their labor and health. This was not a Christian maxim about compassion. It was an administrative conclusion. If the autonomy of those who manage household trifles and store care items is undermined, mortality increases, the number of refugees in neighboring yards increases, and petitions for help multiply. The city is a collective organism, and its offices did not hesitate to write about this without embellishment. Meanwhile, the guild elder brought another sheet, an excerpt from the guild protocol adopted after a controversial case in a neighboring town. There, during the reign of the king's harsh governor, one of the craftsmen tried on his wedding night to take away the order books belonging to his wife, a bookbinder, and declare them common household property. This ended with the entire guild suspending deliveries of leather and thread to his neighborhood, and fellow paper merchants refusing to work with his relatives. As a result, the family not only lost their income, but also barely managed to keep their house from being sold off. Such stories spread without songs and legends because they were useful in themselves as quiet warnings. Corporate discipline in the craft can fix what family legends delight in breaking. The threat of a broken engagement hung in the air like heavy moisture. For an adult woman who had already made a name for herself in the craft, a breakup meant not the end of her personal destiny, but a gaping hole in the fabric of her reputation. In a city where customers choose not only technique, but also reliability, rumors of a broken wedding often turned into indirect accusations, as if the vanished marriage hid debts or disobedience. This invisible measure of shame, which travels faster than messengers, could not be erased with a stroke of the pen. But a few winters ago, after a high-profile case in which one family tried to punish a woman who refused to hand over the key, the city council posted a list of conditions for a dignified refusal on the town hall bulletin board. It was written there clearly, and without poetry, that disagreement with a violation of the ordinances cannot be considered shameful, but pressure on a woman because of her personal property is, on the contrary, a reason to doubt the groom's decency. The board hung next to measuring rulers and weights so that everyone would understand. This is also a measure, and it must be remembered, just as the pound and the cubit are remembered. The clerk carefully copied the reference to this list of conditions into the marriage contract, so that no one would be tempted to interpret silence as consent. While the papers were absorbing the ink, the paramedic, the same one who kept track of injuries and fainting spells in the neighborhoods, came into the office. He was brought in as an expert, not on the subject of the body, but on the subject of limits. Several years of observation had taught him to recognize how minor coercion in one room could grow into a major illness on the street. He briefly and bluntly told the curia what he had recorded in his journals. Where women's personal chests and boxes were taken away, anxiety increased, discipline in caring for the sick declined, mutual aid schemes broke down, and ultimately complaints increased about nighttime screams, which caused the neighbors' children, now adults, to lose their ability to work for several days. The curia was not looking for a moral allegory. It needed a managerial argument, and the paramedic provided it. References to his journal were placed next to the guild's statement, and the paper wall became thicker. At that moment, another turn of events occurred, not a loud one, but one that changed the balance of power. A scribe from the Merchant Guild came to the office and brought a scroll with a list of trusted persons for storing keys and copies of seals. Several seasons ago, when the city was swept by suspicions of seal forgery, the guild decided that copies of keys to personal chests and trunks, if they were kept outside the home, should be given not to the husband's relatives or the father's friends, but to non-family guardians chosen from among respected widows or senior craftswomen. This decision was born out of the ashes of several cases where trust within a single family turned into secret access to other people's scrolls and coins. Now, attached to the marriage contract, an extract from the guild turned a personal box into an element of urban infrastructure rather than a family risk. A copy of the key was to go to the bride's aunt, officially registered as a guarantor through the Brotherhood's office, with a note of the storage location so that the district sergeant could quickly find and seal the box in case of a complaint until the circumstances were clarified. The groom's family resisted, clinging to the signs of their former greatness: the family seal, the family ring, stories of ancestors who served as armed guards for the governor. But such symbols had one flaw: they did not read well in the Book of Fines. The office dug up a case from several decades ago where the current groom's great-uncle had already been on the list of offenders for forcibly restoring order in his daughter-in-law's house. And even though the family name was respected, the line about the fine hung like a stone around his waist. The more such threads were pulled from the archives, the weaker the word custom sounded. It turned into the rustle of fairy tales, which are convenient to tell in a festive room, but impossible to confirm with a seal. It soon became clear that the dispute was moving from last night's kitchen to the field of shares and legal regimes. The notary added a clause to the contract about the different property regimes in the city: that a dowry is property brought into the home and accounted for in the general household, under the control of 2 witnesses; that personal belongings are items that cannot be mixed, especially if they are related to craft, health, and memory; that a common share is acquisitions that appear during the marriage and are recorded in the income book. In reality, such distinctions saved people from many small wars. When things have status, feelings have fewer reasons to turn into weapons. The Curia knew this not from books, but from routine, from the fact that people knocked on its doors at the end of each week, when the merchant carts had already finished unloading, and voices were growing tired. The groom's family made another attempt. They sent a boy to a clergyman they knew, hoping to get a letter with general words about a wife's obedience to her husband. In other times, such letters fluttered in the wind like outposts. But now the Curia, taught by loud disputes with the neighboring bishopric, demanded a distinction between moral instruction and legal norms. The letter was short, without a court seal, and did not contain a word about keys, locks, or chests. It was placed on the edge of the table as an example of paper that sounds good but has no effect. For balance, the scribe brought a summary from the city's preaching assembly, where one of the posts recalled that the house is held together by trust. The summary proved useful in an unexpected way. Trust in it was understood as mutuality, not as a one-sided surrender of keys. This subtle idea was incorporated into the text of the marriage contract with a clear phrase about mutual access to shared chests with the consent of both parties, but not to personal chests. Thus, morality cautiously became an ally of the norm. By midday, an unexpected visitor entered the office, the city land tax collector. He brought a statement of the groom's family's debts over the past few years. The debt was not ruinous, but it was unpleasant, and the list of payments included expected income from the bride's family after the marriage. Such a line was not prohibited, but in the context of the dispute, it spoke louder than a toast. Copies of such calculations often surfaced in cases of sudden inspections of personal cash boxes. The economics of habits emerged in rare strokes from under the festive tablecloth. The demand for a key turned out to be not a ritual of trust, but a projection of a lack of money. The Curia did not moralize, but drew conclusions. Where marriage was built with a view to immediately patching holes, the risk of interference in personal life increased exponentially. It was precisely for such cases that fines were introduced, so that the cost to the Treasury would discourage the desire to patch holes at the expense of others' small fortunes. An unexpected benefactor once again appeared from outside the family. The Sisterhood of Baths, an association of women who looked after cleanliness and the treatment of minor wounds, sent a letter reminding them of their long-standing, seal-confirmed privilege of supplying care kits to newlyweds' homes. These kits, they insisted, should be kept in private chests and be accessible primarily to the wife. The letter listed cases where the intervention of male relatives had led to the loss of medicines and delays in caring for sick children and the elderly. The sisterhood did not ask for punishment. It asked that the husband's obligation to respect the storage of such kits be enshrined in the marriage contract. The letter became a third layer of protection. Sanitary regulations were added to guild and neighborhood regulations. The city was not afraid of stratification because it was the basis of its ability to live side by side without mutual destruction. As the case grew thicker with references and appendices, fatigue thickened in the air. But fatigue did not equal reconciliation. The groom's family understood that if the contract was signed as proposed, the familiar legend of the key would dissolve, and a new reality would take hold in the room, where privacy would be declared inviolable and protected by a fine. With a last effort, they proposed a compromise: access to the box in exceptional circumstances. The Curia also had a tool for such cases: a list of extraordinary circumstances adopted immediately after the plague-stricken autumn: sudden fire, sudden pestilence, evacuation of the courtyard by order of the council. In these cases, access to personal belongings was only possible through the sealing of the chest and the presence of a guarantor, and any items taken had to be recorded in a separate list. This dry bureaucracy sounds like a mockery of romantic rituals, but it is precisely what prevents the worst, when fear makes people quick and cruel. Outside the window, meanwhile, the same carts carrying fish and grain rolled by, and the city lived at its moderate pace. In the office, quills and sand for drying ink were in use. In the corner stood a box of seals, each on a string, each with a history. The clerks were in no hurry to finish. They knew that if they left even one ambiguity, in a year's time there would be a new case on the table about an open chest, a broken lid, someone's nighttime hysterics, a request to return what is rightfully theirs. These cases do not make a fuss, but they drain the city like small, constant leaks in the walls. There was no glory in their craft, but there was the memory of how once unsightly lines saved people from prolonged breakdown. Now, the typeset sheet of the marriage contract resembled a map. Every word was a point. Every reference was a road sign. Every clause was a bridge over a potential rift. It included an unambiguous list of the dowry, a register of personal belongings related to craft and health, the appointment of a female guarantor to keep a copy of the key, penalties for interference and the appeal procedure in the neighborhood, and, as recently proposed by the sisterhood, the husband's fixed obligation not to interfere with the storage and replenishment of care kits. Next to it lay a register of the groom's family debts. It was not part of the contract, but it became a context that the Curia was not going to ignore. At this point, another institution intervened: the Brotherhood of City Keepers of Weights and Measures. They rarely touched on family contracts, but here they saw their interest. When the dispute is about small things, common measures are lost. The guild submitted a short note to enshrine in the contract the procedure for accounting for joint purchases, which could not later be declared personal or reversed. Their involvement seemed strange, but it fit neatly into the fabric of the contract. The clearer the common ground is recorded, the easier it is to protect the personal. This contradiction, which seems acute in conversation, turned into agreement on paper. At the end of the day, the Curia invited 2 witnesses, neighbors who were not related to either party, to the office. This was a new practice that had emerged after several high-profile cases of false testimony by relatives. The neighbors confirmed that the bride was an adult, independent in her affairs, kept her tools and records at her own home, not at her father's, and that the box had long served as a place to store small but important items. Their testimony was not about feelings, but about facts. When, where, and in what order they saw how things were stored. The city taught witnesses to speak without embellishment, and it was this simple manner that determined how many empty words would remain outside the door. Gradually, the contract became filled with a weight that could not be countered with a saying. The turning point was that family custom lost its monopoly on language. Now the town hall spoke about the house, as did the guilds, sisterhoods, brotherhoods, neighborhood councils, the fine books, and the paramedics' journal. There was no shouting in this chorus, but there was the power of enumeration. And it was enumeration that broke the habit. Those who wanted to preserve their petty comforts could only murmur about past glories and look at seals as if they were shackles, even though seals were merely tools of memory. Twilight crept over the windows, and the shadows of the clerks lengthened. The groom's family was about to leave the office, but before leaving, they tried to have their last word, not a threat or a request, but an announcement. If the contract was signed as it stood, they would reconsider the size of the wedding gifts and part of the celebration. The Curia responded, as it was taught to respond to attempts to exchange the right to favor. A short line was added to the contract, stating that it was unacceptable to link consent to legal stipulations with the refusal of promised gifts. And next to it was a reference to the council's decision, where a similar attempt had already been recognized as a means of pressure and had resulted in sanctions. When rules are gathered in one place, any movement against them leaves a trace, and that trace can be measured. All this time, the box stood on the table, a silent reminder of the boundary that strangers' hands had grown accustomed to touching. Its lid is painted with vines, and the thin grain of the wood shows traces of the fingers of several generations of women who found in it something that could not be discussed at family gatherings. Around it grew not an idol, but fastenings, reservations, penalties, guarantors, measures, and scales. The legend of the key, lofty and resonant in table conversations, deflated when columns of documents were stacked nearby. And while the seal cooled on the wax, one could feel the city breathing evenly. Another crack closed, another reason for nighttime cries taken away from habit. The main denouement remained ahead: the decision, the signatures, the announcement of fines and boundaries that would be upheld not only by paper, but also by the community. But it was already clear that the outcome would not come from the resounding victory of one voice over another, but from the persistence of a form that had learned to protect the small human from the large seizure under the name of tradition. The night brought no relief, because matters involving habits rarely fall asleep with the market. While the office was closing its shutters, the district sergeant received orders to place the bride's family under soft surveillance, not as a threat, but to prevent the matter from turning into a street scene. This was a measure learned after difficult years. When the dispute concerned small chests and personal records, all too often the groom's concerned relatives would appear on the doorstep in the morning with the intention of counting the goods before signing. In those years, when the city was not yet able to affix interim seals, such visits ended in broken lids, and the paramedic's books were filled with records of breakdowns and fainting spells, which then caused his hands to twitch and his sleep to disappear for several days. Now, however, the sergeant, barely visible in the twilight, stood on the corner, counting the shadows and seeking no glory. he was satisfied with the quiet benefit of a night that would pass without intrusion. This silence was also a document, only not on paper, but in the bodies of people who would not tremble with memories in the morning. The morning brought a new complication, which life itself loved. A court guardian for debt cases appeared at the office with a demand to include a hidden pledge in the marriage contract. It turned out that several seasons ago, the groom's family had given a merchant from the fish market a small silver buckle and a note about the right of redemption after the marriage took place. The amount was specified, and the return was promised from the common household. On the surface, it was an innocent maneuver, but it wove another thread into the fabric of the case. The desire to gain access to personal property coincided with the need to close an old hole. The Curia did not consider this a crime, but a new clause appeared in the margins of the contract. Personal belongings cannot be used to pay off the groom's family's previous debts, and any hint of this is interpreted as pressure. The dry line became a safeguard against the old trick when family troubles were laid out on the table as exquisite morality, and in the end, it turned out that they were not talking about honor, but about interest rates. The groom's family tried to play it differently and brought a collection of scrolls of examples of piety to the office, where every page mentioned remote villages under the rule of monasteries with harsh customs, where the head of the household ruled without reservation. These scrolls were brought from afar and read like fortune-telling, not to understand, but to appease habits. But the city office, having survived winters without grain and summers without salt, had learned to distinguish between embellished words and working signs. Where monastic statutes ruled outside the city's jurisdiction, there were no neighborhood fines, no guild guarantors, no bathhouse sisterhoods, no list of worthy refusals. In these lands, everything was decided at the abbot's doorstep, and paper left no lasting traces. The city, on the other hand, was held together by accumulated memory, and only because of this was it able to survive another wave of disease without falling into the void. The Curia attached a brief summary of the differences between the legal systems to the case, so that in the future, no one would think of using someone else's charter as an excuse for a night search in a house where its own measures and weights were in force. Meanwhile, a middle-aged woman wearing a closed headscarf came to the office, a trusted representative of the widows whose name was listed in the register of guarantors. She had been appointed the keeper of the duplicate key by prior agreement, made even before the quarrel. Her appearance was a quiet turning point. The box ceased to be the subject of dispute between the two families, and found a point of equilibrium in the person of someone who was not connected with the debts and fame of either side. In her hands, the key ceased to be a symbol of caprice and became an instrument of accountability. She handed the office a receipt for the duplicate, noted where it would be kept, and agreed to appear when summoned by the district sergeant in case of emergency. The city loved such figures, inconspicuous but replacing shouting. Their appearance always annoyed those who were used to resolving issues with generous toasts and heavy glances, because instead of one big lever, they put out 3 small pins, which, when removed, left marks on the paper. At noon, the Curia took up what usually remained in the shadows, rechecking those very false examples with which the groom's family tried to shame him. The scribes raised several cases in neighboring cities, where rumors of the key tradition had reached. It turned out that every time the dispute reached the courtroom, the tradition crumbled into private domestic stories without seals or marks, and the essence of the case invariably boiled down to one of 2 simple schemes: either an attempt to quickly patch up debts by seizing personal silver, or a desire to get hold of records of a wife's daily wages if she was a craftswoman. This recurring motif was placed on the table next to the letter from the bathhouse sisterhood and the paramedic's report. A picture emerged in which myth helped only where paper had not yet managed to stretch a net of reservations. In cities where such a net was already in place, tradition turned into a raised eyebrow from an elder, which no one was obliged to believe. The groom's family, weary and irritated, tried one last legal trick. They proposed to write down that access to the box was possible by the honor of the house, that is, in the presence of the clan elder. This time, the curia not only refused, but also included a mirror rule in the contract. Any actions with personal belongings could only take place in the presence of an outside guarantor listed in the register, and at the same time, it was mandatory to make an entry in the register listing what had been taken and the terms of return. Thus, the word honor finally ceased to serve as a pass to someone else's lid and began to require a signature, seal, and date in writing. This was the logic of the city. It did not destroy great words. It made them work within measurable limits. Otherwise, they turned into a stick for the night corridor. Then the matter took a turn that would later be called a hidden kinship, not blood, but documentary. While sorting through old volumes, the clerk stumbled upon the marriage certificate of the groom's aunt, signed many years ago by another notary. There, in black and white, was a clause about a personal chest with jewelry and letters, with a prohibition on opening it without her consent and the same penalties. It turned out that within the same family name, a boundary had once been recognized that was now being declared invalid. This discovery did not cause an uproar, but it became a mirror that was difficult to look away from. The internal contradiction of a family is the best destroyer of its own legend, because it cannot be argued with a narrative about outside influences. The curia attached a copy of the aunt's letter to the case, and it became apparent how the thin threads holding back the threat of a breakup had weakened. In the afternoon, a messenger from the pawnshop arrived with a polite but firm request to include in the contract a prohibition on pawning items from the list of personal belongings without the written consent of the owner. This was in the pawnshop's interest as well. Too often, they became involuntary participants in family wars, and then the sergeant would come to them and demand that they return the items without question. The shop did not interfere in morality. It asked for clarity because clarity protected it from fines and anger. The curia accepted this short document with gratitude. Each external participant strengthened the contract, turning it from theoretical protection into practical protection. The more such nodes there are, the more difficult it is to break the system in one fell swoop. In the evening, the archdeacon came to the office, not to exert pressure, but as a representative of the spiritual authority that controlled matrimonial matters from the point of view of canon law. He brought a selection of recent rulings on the consent of spouses as the basis of marriage and on the difference between joint property and personal gifts. These rulings were born not out of leniency, but out of calculation. The ecclesiastical court was tired of endless complaints about intrusions that took up time and energy and preferred to stay ahead of the next wave by putting into writing what had previously been said in sermons. The decrees did not mention keys directly, but their logic was the same. Consent is an action, not silence. It must be recorded. The sheets from the spiritual authority attached to the case made it impossible to continue bargaining over the honor of the houses as notes in the margins. Now there was a stamp in the corner of the sheet, and the dispute over interpretation boiled down to the question of, is there a signature or not? The groom's family, realizing that their options were limited, tried to mitigate the consequences by offering to reduce the penalties for the violation, counting on it being a first time. The curia refused, citing sad statistics. Where the first time did not result in serious losses, the second time happened too often. The paramedic confirmed that many of the serious consequences in his journals began with a minor intervention, after which tension in the family became constant and the habit of violating boundaries became commonplace. The contract included a clause stating that the same strict measures would be applied for the first and any subsequent violations. The city did not like whips, but it liked recurring breakdowns even less, which spread like wildfire through the market, the school, and the shops. By this time, the bride, mature and aware of the value of her craft, made no loud statements or complaints. This was evident in the case file from the blank lines in the explanations of the parties column. But the emptiness did not mean silence. The testimonies of the guild, the sisterhood, the neighborhood, the shop, and the spiritual authorities spoke for her, as did the records of past fines and the letter found from her aunt. In the city's legal system, such a chorus is more important than any eloquence. It turned a personal decision into a public knot that could no longer be untied in one hut without consequences for the entire street. At the end of the day, another letter appeared from the Night Watchmen's Association, which in recent years had been given the authority to seal a house in case of a threat of vigilante justice. They asked to have the right to immediately seal chests and trunks in case of an attempted break-in without consent enshrined in the contract, even if the disputing parties claimed that everything will remain in the house. It seemed like a trifle, but it was precisely such trifles that kept the city from nighttime hysteria. The Curia accepted this clause as well. Now the box was protected not only by law, but also by the police. Try to touch it, and you'll have to deal not with someone else's birthday, but with the seal and the registry. When all the sheets were laid out on the table, the contract resembled a tabular summary. The dowry was spelled out without ambiguity. Personal belongings were highlighted with reference to craft, health, and memory. A guarantor was appointed for the duplicate key. Penalties were determined without a first-time discount. Extraordinary circumstances were agreed upon with sealing and a list. The use of personal items for old debts was prohibited. It was prescribed to keep care kits in a personal chest. A pawn shop and a watchman's partnership were involved. In this form, the document no longer required loud words. It simply proposed an order in which habit could not hide behind legend. The groom's family, weary and downcast, reduced their threats of a breakup to a vague hint, but even that hint lost its teeth. A list of conditions for dignified refusal had been hanging on the board in the town hall for several years, and anyone who tried to turn the signed norm into disgrace risked finding themselves on the list of suspicious houses where goods would no longer be delivered on credit. Twilight fell on the city, and somewhere on the pier, the last exchanges of dried fish died down. In the office, one candle was extinguished, then another, leaving only the one that stood directly above the box. Its lid, painted with a vine, cast a trembling shadow on the parchment, but this shadow no longer frightened. It was not from uncertainty, but from the fire they used to see more clearly. The next day lay ahead. Signatures, seals, the dry pronouncement of the fine in writing, a last attempt to sigh sonorously about the greatness of the ancients, and then the quiet click of the notary register's lid. But the main thing had already happened. The myth, accustomed to living on table talk and memories, had been placed alongside documents that could withstand the winter. And so his voice became like a noise in my head, which recedes when items are laid out on the table, according to a list, and a key is placed next to them on a string attached to the name of an adult woman. The night slowly flowed into a gray morning, and the rustle of sand sprinkled on fresh lines on parchment filled the room again. The office moved in its usual orbit. The clerk aired the room. The sergeant noted the change of guard at the door. The scribes transferred a reference to yesterday's additions to the edge of the sheet. At this hour, the city likes to pretend that great things are decided by themselves, simply because people came on time and signed their names. But everyone knows that where a myth has lived long without verification, it does not give up easily. Therefore, before the meeting began, the notary requested from the Brotherhood of Measures and Waite's duplicates of last year's resolutions on household records in order to remove the last loophole, the dispute over how much and what, by common sense, is considered small and therefore accessible without consent. The duplicates were brought quickly. On thick parchment, items that the city was accustomed to declaring insignificant, in order to dispel reservations, were dryly listed: pins, combs, cords, small bubbles, notepads, threads, simple rings without stones. Next to it, without poetry, was the formula. Small is not something that does not catch the eye, but something that has a set accounting price. If the price is not specified, it is determined by the market according to the current month's act, and interference in small is punishable as interference in any property. This phrase, honed over years of debate, eliminated the favorite maneuver of those who pocketed trifles and then used these trifles to extract the rest. The groom's family arrived a little later and brought a cleverly composed scroll of the family oath, where a simple goal could be guessed through the flowery formulas, to return the initiative to a symbolic plane, where any reservations sound like distrust. The scroll was adorned with ancient names and military deeds, but it did not bear the seal of the city curia, and at the bottom was the new signature of a young scribe, known for his love of beautiful turns of phrase and his weakness for debt contracts. His self-admiration smelled of fresh ink, and the curia did not argue with the letters. It placed next to it a copy of the groom's aunt's letter, where long ago, without drama, there was a reservation about the inviolability of personal property. The internal conflict of the family hung in the air like a torn seam on expensive clothing. It could be mended, but the mark would remain visible, and everyone who saw it would know where the fabric would come apart at the slightest effort. Then the market intervened, not in the form of a merchant with a sharp nose, but in the person of the credit line trustee. He brought a report on the seasonal decline in trust fund revenues and a note on how often minor lawsuits are filed over common needs, which for some reason involve the personal belongings of wives. The note contained no moralizing, only dry arithmetic of consequences. Where coins or strings of coral were taken out of boxes through custom, the next season saw an increase in delays in paying debts to shops and more frequent breakdowns of marriages in the first year. The city knew the value of the first year. It was like a paving stone. If it cracked now, the seam would creak every winter. The curia filed the note with the case, and thus shifted the dispute from the zone of honors to the zone of stability, where honor is measured by how many winter-summer cycles a house can withstand, rather than how high one's chin is raised at a feast. Meanwhile, the Bookbinders Guild, which supported the bride, proposed another protocol. If the family dispute did spill over into the craft, the guild would temporarily take custody of the craftswoman's notebooks with a transfer of ownership document to prevent accidental losses. This seemed unnecessary, but the case already contained a report from the paramedic, where dry lines about nightly inspections were almost always accompanied by notes about missing pages from the lists of debtors. Someone knew how to cut books so that only inconvenient debts disappeared, and then declare the gaps to be female forgetfulness. The guild's new stipulation put a stop to the cutters. To remove a sheet, it would now be necessary to first open the guild's records, and this threatened the entire family with isolation in the market. In cities where orders go to the usual hands, isolation hits harder than a boot. While the clerks were checking the references, the district sergeant entered silently and placed a short report about the night before the notary. In a neighboring alley, the groom's relatives tried to organize a peace council under the windows of the bride's house, but after 3 warnings from the guard, relying on the new practice, they were taken to the guardhouse and forced to sign a paper agreeing to cease pressure during the hearings. There was no mention of a duel or heroism in the report, just names written next to the word warning. These lines are the silent muscle of the city. When they multiply, people stopped confusing the square in front of the house with a courtroom. The curia wrote the guard's paper number in the margins of the contract so that no one would play forgetful tomorrow. The groom's family moved on to saving symbols. They suggested removing the word fine from the text and replacing it with gift to the treasury in case of distress. The curia did not argue about feelings. It showed the account book, where it was clearly stated in black and white, where gifts for distress replaced fines. After 1 or 2 winters, repeat cases appeared in which the distress was forgotten, along with the promise for the future. The account book knew no sarcasm. It knew the frequency of returns. The phrase fine remained in place, and another safeguard was added. In the event of repeated interference, the amount would automatically double without negotiation, and a third would go to the neighborhood watch to fund night patrols. This, too, is urban logic. Those who pay for order have a chance to see it through to the end. The turn, prepared yesterday, manifested itself unexpectedly quickly. A woman from the shop where duplicate seals were kept came to the office and brought a book of receipts. It turned out that a few weeks earlier, one of the groom's cousins had tried to leave a family mark on the key for safekeeping so that he could later present it as a sign of the bride's consent. The book contained his signature and an empty column for the person who gave consent. They did not accept the key, and the attempt to retroactively obtain consent was recorded as potential preparation for pressure. No one would have seen this entry if the dispute had not escalated to the office. Now it lay next to his aunt's letter and became a second shadow of habit, the kind of shadow that myths usually sweep under the rug. The word pattern appeared in the dry row of documents, although the scribes did not write it. The repetitiveness of gestures betrayed the system better than any confession. By noon, another layer had been added to the case, a summary of sanitary regulations adopted after the last wave of fever, when wedding feasts often became hotbeds of infection. There, among the rules on ventilation and clean water, was a short line about the inadmissibility of removing from personal chests care kits and supplies that women had collected in advance in case of sudden illness. This line was not born in the quiet of councils, but on the benches at the paramedics' tables, where women cried not from pain, but from helplessness. Someone had taken the tincture or bandages for general needs, and when the time came, they were not at hand. The inclusion of sanitary standards in the marriage certificate turned the box into a strategic reserve rather than a women's corner. It is difficult to argue with something that has measurable consequences on the body. The groom's family still relied on the threat of a breakup. Through an acquaintance who was a scribe, they passed on a list of losses for honor in the event of signing alien stipulations: a reduced feast, refusal of a number of gifts, coldness between the families. The curia, without arguing about taste, brought out a board with a list of worthy refusals that hung in the town hall and attached copies of the signatures of 3 families who had once tried to educate the city in the same way with their silence and received in return a refusal of shop credits and a temporary freeze on participation in auctions. Those with full pantries can easily weather the chill. In the city, pantries are filled not with conversation, but with loans and access to the queue. The papers spoke louder than threats. Next, the curia took up what seemed to be a tedious procedure, making exceptions to the general regime in case of rare state requisitions. In times of famine and war, the council could demand silver or part of the fabrics from houses for the treasury. To prevent these emergency measures from becoming a loophole, a clause was added to the contract stating that requisitions applied to common property and dowries, but not to personal chests where items related to crafts and care were stored, except in cases of a direct order from the council, with subsequent compensation at the market price for the current month. This clause seemed painfully pedantic, but it closed another loophole. It had long been noticed that private habits surfaced under the guise of official duty, and where there was no boundary on paper, someone was bound to take someone else's property, hiding behind, "Everyone knows how busy we are." As the document grew line by line, there was a quiet knock at the door, and two old men entered, unconnected with either house, the keepers of the municipal archives. They brought a heavy register of decisions on matrimonial disputes over the past decades, and asked to enter a reference to the precedent where the court first equated an attempt to open a personal chest with trespassing on the peace of the home. This precedent had a greater impact at the time than the words of famous preachers. It allowed the sergeant to seal the house immediately, without waiting for lengthy readings at the altar. The reference to it strengthened the current sheet, like a stone buttress against a wall where there used to be a thin wooden support. The groom's family turned pale. Stiffening ribs appeared on the wall, which could no longer be climbed over without leaving traces. At that moment, another document was placed on the table, which was missing to complete the picture. A list of items left to the wife without the right of alienation, even in the event of a divorce. This list was discussed in the city after a series of difficult divorces, when women left empty-handed because they could not prove that this or that belonged to them. The list was still the same dry one: craft tools, personal work records, care items, small jewelry received from the mother, and other items recognized as personal at the time of marriage according to the inventory. It was this last phrase that elevated the importance of today's inventory of the box to the level of future insurance. A careless line today meant empty hands tomorrow. The city taught precision as a survival skill, not as a refinement. Another quiet but sharp turn came from where no one expected it. A young apprentice bookbinder from another workshop peeked into the office and asked the foreman to pass on a rumor circulating in the market. The groom's relatives were looking for someone who could replace the lock with one just like it, so that they could later claim that the box had opened by itself. The guild knew the price of such tricks. In recent years, 3 metalworkers had been caught doing this, and all 3 had been banned from working in the quarter. The apprentices did not install the new safety device based on a single note, but the guild foreman sent out a notice to the workshops just in case. Any work on personal chests during the days of marriage negotiations was only allowed on behalf of the curia and with an entry in the order book. Thus, the myth of overcaution was accompanied by an insurance document. The box was surrounded not by platoons, but by channels, along which any strange step would leave a wet trail. To top it all off, the spiritual authority sent a short comment on good practice of reconciliation. If the groom's family is still concerned about the non-festive nature of the stipulations, the ecclesiastical court is ready to recommend a special form of blessing that emphasizes the reciprocity of responsibilities and respect for each person's personal sphere. It looked like an attempt to restore the ritual's place in a city where paper had defeated song. The curia willingly filed this away, because in its eyes, ritual is good when it fills a void rather than replacing a rule. Even the guards were happy with these comments. Fewer reasons for nighttime sighs and loud toasts, which so often end with a knock on the lid of someone else's chest. By evening, the document had become truly weighty. It could be measured not only in pages, but also in the number of institutions involved: the guild, the sisterhood, the brotherhood of measures, the pawn shop, the credit union, the sanitary office, the night watchman, the ecclesiastical court, the municipal archive, and the neighborhood council. Each contributed a brick, and the wall around the box began to resemble a house. The groom's family stood before it, not as victors, but as passers-by, who realized that the shortcut was closed and now had to walk down the street, where faces were visible and footsteps could be heard. Their last objections concerned the form of the seal, but here too, the curia left little room for maneuver. The seal is affixed with wax to the cord of the chest and to the contract sheet. The cord is sealed with a special mark. A duplicate of the mark is kept by the guarantor and the guild elder, and any trace of interference is recorded as an attempt to break it. This mechanism was considered boring in the city, but boredom was included in the list of virtues. It saved energy for the winter. Outside the windows, the blue sky was darkening, and the candles could no longer cope with the twilight. The clerks moved the stands so that the light fell on the lines about fines and appeals, where it was written in full. The offender pays immediately and can argue later. The phrase, "first pay, then argue," had once caused an uproar, but now it was swallowed whole, because thanks to it, by winter, the street cleaners received salt to sprinkle on the streets, and the watchmen received oil for the lanterns. The city paid with its own money for the right not to listen to the outcry. And here, in the middle of the case about a small box with a comb, beads, and notebooks, this right was once again enshrined in bold print. It was at this very moment that the one whom everyone had been waiting for in the early days, and who had never come, appeared at the door, the bride's distant uncle, who had once traded in fabrics, and was now a taciturn man with dry hands. He entered not as a savior, but as a trusted guarantor, in case the aunt appointed as the keeper of the duplicate fell ill or left for a distant parish. His name was on the register of people trusted with seals, and his appearance put the final touch on the chain of insurance. Now, even a change of guarantor would not destroy the system. It was a turning point without fanfare. Once again, the unexpected benefactor was not the hero of songs, but the one who brought his ID with him on time and was ready to vouch for the cord and wax. In such people, the city kept the memory that without unnecessary words, it was possible to keep the lid away from prying fingers. When the uncle signed, the last series of actions remained, announcing the amounts of the fines in writing, referring to the decent refusal board, recording the sanitary clause, and noting the requisitions. The groom's family tried once again to take a deep breath, to utter a sonorous phrase about past greatness, but their voices came out hoarse. The paper did not argue. It lay on the table in a heavy order that was accustomed to enduring winter. And although the signature was not yet there, it was clear that the outcome was no longer hidden in the corner. The key remained with the adult woman. The cord was being prepared for printing. The guarantors kept their registers at hand, and the guards checked the lanterns on the corner. In this city, scorched by hunger and disease, this was what real protection looked like. No one promised happiness, but many guaranteed that they would not knock on the lid of the box at night, hiding behind the word custom carved out of someone else's misfortune. Towards morning, the air was damp, and the parchment drank in the moisture as eagerly as the city drank in clear rules. The office unrolled the scroll to its edges to add a controversial point about memory and letters, and this turned out to be the most difficult knot to untangle. The groom's family sought recognition of personal records as potentially socially significant if they concerned debts and relations with neighbors, and therefore accessible for familiarization by household members without inventory. Copies of previous cases were laid out on the table. In one case, sheets with lists of debtors were torn out to erase traces of unpaid family loans. In another, letters from customers were taken away because they indirectly confirmed the wife's payment for her work. Archivists showed what such familiarization leads to. The Book of Fines dryly notes torn covers, damaged records, belated complaints, and the loss of the opportunity to collect payment. The Curia formulated a rule to close this loophole. Personal correspondence and work records are recognized as documents of property and labor, stored in a chest, accessible only with the consent of the owner or upon written request of the court. Any familiarization without an inventory is equated with interference and entails a fine, and in case of repetition, a double fine and a temporary restriction on the offender's participation in quarterly auctions. It seemed harsh, but the city knew the price of the words, "We'll figure it out later." Behind them usually disappeared the lines by which one could live. The sanitary office sent another thin sheet as an attachment, which marked the beginning of a subtle but important shift. A list of items of dignity kept by women in their personal boxes and not subject to public discussion. Simple, almost invisible things like combs, scarves, small icons, threads, and glass bottles. The directive explained this, not in a beautiful way, but in a practical way. Public discussion of such items provokes interference and leads to conflicts, causing the neighborhood to lose working days. This language seemed devoid of emotion, but it was precisely this language that allowed the councils to talk to stubborn households, not about honor, but about lost time and income. The clause was woven into the contract alongside the rule about letters, and the box was given another clear boundary, not around luxury items, but around everyday things that keep the courtyard running smoothly. The Bookbinders Guild, as an interested party, introduced an amendment on stichki postupleni. If a craftswoman keeps order and payment records in a chest, the guild has the right, at her request, to take them into storage in a sealed bag in the event of a threat of conflict. The envelope is sealed with the guild's seal and registered in the general register, and opening it without the owner's consent is tantamount to interference with the guild's documents. This mechanism was born out of someone else's bitter experience, where family quarrels tore up books and broke the chains of debt between paper shops, workshops, and curios. Now, the chain was transferred to the protection of neighbors in the same trade and ceased to depend on the leniency of someone else's hand. Meanwhile, a restriction on ritual replacements was added to the contract fields, a massive loophole that was often used by homes with rich imaginations. It allowed any item to be declared a ritual accessory, removed from the inventory and taken out for temporary decoration of the home. Archivists raised cases where coral threads and simple rings disappeared in this way, allegedly for a wedding crown or for verbal reconciliation. The Curia confirmed the formula. An item is recognized as ritual only if there is an early record with the seals of the spiritual authority and the district. An attempt to declare it ritual after the fact is considered a trick and is punishable by a fine. For the city, this was not a war on customs, but a repair of leaks. If you leave a crack, water will find its way in. The credit union made its own concise contribution. A note that pawn shops refuse to accept items from the list of personal belongings as collateral without the written consent of the owner, indicating the term and amount. Violation by the pawn shop will result in a fine and a temporary ban on operations. This brought those who were more often than others, used as instruments of pressure by others, into line with the general order. Stealing an item without having anywhere to cash it in is too expensive, and the city knew how to make bad habits costly. Towards noon, the softened light pierced through the windows, and the servant carefully turned the scroll over so that the ink would not smudge where the signatures were to be collected. But there was still the section on emergency cases to be completed: fire, sudden pestilence, requisitions by the council. This section was compiled from several documents from recent years, in which the city had learned to live with misfortune in layers. It stated, in case of fire, the chest shall be sealed and moved to a safe place in the presence of a guarantor or district sergeant. In case of an epidemic, priority shall be given to the storage of care items, their accounting and replenishment without hindrance. In the event of requisition, the council only concerns itself with common and dowry items, while personal items are subject to compensation at the market price of the current month. In each case, the key remained in the hands of the owner or her guarantor, and the concepts of urgent and without consent were interpreted in different ways. In other words, The city taught itself not to turn misfortune into an excuse for petty theft. The turn of events, which had been carefully prepared, did not come from the authorities, but from within the groom's family. Another sheet was found in the archive bundles, his aunt's old marriage contract, where the inviolability of the chest was already enshrined. This document was filed next to it, and suddenly the familiar rhetoric about family honor collided with the family's own history, recorded in the same ink. The contradiction did not require accusations. It was enough to put the two sheets side by side to make it clear that the custom changed according to the needs of specific men and was not a pillar of the century. And the myth lost another tooth because people see their own signature differently than someone else's seal. The groom's family made a half-hearted attempt to resort to symbolism. They wanted to replace the word fine with gift and pleasure of the treasury. The accounting book responded dryly. Where gifts replaced fines, repeat violations in the first 2 years were twice as frequent as where fines remained fines and were collected immediately. The Curia left the harsh term and added a firm formula. For the first violation, the fine is collected without installment payments. Upon repetition, it is doubled and accompanied by a temporary block on access to preferential trade and credit. The city paid guards and doctors, not from toasts, but from fines. This zinc taste in the text suited everyone better than honey in words. The next touch was the patrol of objects, a notification to the Night Watchmen's Association that during the days of marriage contracts, any work on the locks of personal chests could only be carried out on behalf of the Curia with a record of the craftsman and the time, and that attempts at quiet replacement would be punished with a double fine for the performer and the customer. The message came not from the clang of swords, but from the sons of tin-plated discipline, who in recent years had seen too many accidental coincidences of carved holes with nighttime family councils. Now, instead of shouting in the square, there were cords, seals, and craftsmen with records. Meanwhile, the contract map had become dense, and the last detail remained to be settled: the procedure of viewing with inventory. The Curia stipulated that if the owner agreed to the inspection, it would be recorded in a brief note indicating the reason, time, and list of items, and the weight of items that had weight, and the condition of those that did not, would be recorded, and upon completion, a mirror record of the same would be made. Thus, the word inspection was stripped of its hook, which was usually used to catch other people's weaknesses. Without an inventory, no legal action could now be taken. By the time the sand on the ink had dried, the room smelled of wax and old wood. The notary opened a box with seals, and the guarantor, an adult widow from the registry, handed over a receipt for the storage of a duplicate key and received a new mark on a cord, a seal corresponding to the mark on the contract. The guild elder handed over a sealed envelope for the craftswoman's notebooks, in case of temporary transfer to guild storage in case of escalation. The guards made a note in the book that the councils under the windows were no longer gathering, and that the warned relatives had come to sign without attempting a noisy demonstration. These were not gestures of victory, but stitches in the fabric, thanks to which it would not fall apart at the first sign of bad weather. The signatures were made slowly, as was customary in a city where visible stability was valued. First, the witnesses' neighbors signed, whose names were not bound by debts or promises of gifts. Their words were sparse, and that was precisely why people were accustomed to believing them. Then came the guild elder and the guarantor. Next was the bride's side. The groom's family held the pen over the line the longest, as if trying to find another corridor in the air, but everything that had once been a passageway was now closed off by seals, references, tariffs, and registers. The pen trembled, first drawing a straight line, then a name. And then the notary read aloud, dryly, without emphasis, the key provisions. personal inviolability, prohibition of viewing without inventory, procedure for emergencies, penalty without discounts for the first time, double for repeat offenses, sanctions in the credit line, protection of labor records by the Guild, sanitary list, prohibition of pledging without written consent. Voices did not rise. The paper did not need persuasion. It demanded execution. Immediately after the signatures, the guards brought a small wooden stand with wax. The seal was placed on the cord of the chest, repeated on the contract sheet, and the guarantor received a duplicate with an identical mark. This triple seam did the main thing. It took the key out of the zone of someone else's goodwill and into the zone of recorded responsibility. From now on, even her own uncle, if he suddenly decided to check just in case, would first have to report to the cord, wax, and register, and only then to his conscience. The city had long since learned not to confuse these cues. After the seals, the Curia took care of the last block, sending out notifications. The neighborhood council received a notification about the concluded contract with a reference to the penalty clauses, the credit line, about sanctions in case of interference, and the bail regime, the Guild, about the right to accept the master's notebooks, the sanitary office, about the confirmation of the list of care items, the Watchmen's Association, about the right to immediate printing in case of a complaint about interference, the archive, about filing a copy in the case files. This network of letters made it impossible to quietly cancel the agreement in one room. Even if someone tried to rewrite it for themselves, each node already held the end of the rope. The city outside the windows breathed more evenly. Market traders argued over the price of salt. Children chased hoops across the cobblestones, and people who had endured hunger and fever lived with a sluggish stability. And yet, within this resilience, there was still room for shadows, the kind that come into any home when the door closes and all visits end. It was for the sake of these shadows that a subtle line was included in the contract. The landlord's obligation to keep a weekly record of any actions involving shared chests. It seemed unnecessary, but it tied in with the personal, which is usually separated from it. If a man is accustomed to reporting on the movement of the common, it is more difficult for him to convince himself that the personal is nothing. A small record turned good intentions into a morning habit. A few days after signing, the paramedic made his usual note. The neighborhood had become quieter. There were no complaints about nighttime councils under the windows, and the guard's logbook was empty. This invisible result was the city's goal. Not a celebration, not a blessing, just an empty column where otherwise drops of anxiety would accumulate. The groom's family did not bear the mark of shame. The honorable refusal hung in the town hall, not for the sake of punishment, but for the sake of verification. They held a more modest feast than promised, but there was plenty of bread and warm soup on the table, and the neighbors did not turn away, because their names did not appear next to the word violation in the invoices. The bride, mature and stubborn, wrote 2 new orders in her notebook on the first day after the wedding, for the binding of a spiritual book and for the restoration of the old salt shop register. Her box stood on the shelf, smelling of wax. Inside were threads, a comb, letters, a small icon, coins from her earnings, and clean needles. The key hung on an internal hook. The duplicate was with her guarantor. The trace was in the registers, and this whole network seemed cumbersome only to the ear. In reality, it was light and strong, like a well-stitched spine. You can't see it until the book opens evenly. Once upon a time, people in this city liked to say that everything in the house belongs to the husband, and this phrase sounded like a tower bell closing the debate. Now the bell rang on schedule, and disputes were settled by lines in which everything was divided into dowry, common, and personal, and home was divided into the space of customs and the space of law. Nothing lofty, just discipline. But it was precisely this discipline that provided the atmosphere in which one did not have to listen to footsteps under the windows at night and wait to see if someone would come just to take a look. And when, once again, someone at the market sighed that things were easier in the old days, the quietest old woman, holding a table with beans, without arguing at all, counted her coins, put one in her breast pocket, and said in a word-by-word retelling, as is done in such cities, "In the old days it was louder, but now it is smoother," and this is perhaps the best description that can be attached to a small box with a comb, letters, and threads. After the signatures, the city did not change outwardly. The same baskets with greens, the same carts with fish and grain, the same streets where the wind blows dust toward the gates. But inside the knots that bind people together, something clicked and fell into place. The contract was sent to the addresses. The neighborhood council entered the number in the register. The credit union noted the sanctions regime. The Bookbinders Guild received the right to accept the craftswoman's notebooks under threat of intervention. The sanitary office received a memo about personal care kits, and the guard received the right to immediately seal the chest in case of a complaint. The box, barely noticeable on the shelf, turned out to be woven into a system where each node knows which string to pull if a habit is broken somewhere. The first test occurred where new rules usually break down, during the peaceful week after the wedding. In the evening, when the noise in the house subsided, the groom's cousin tried to bypass the cord. There were no screams, no broken things. There was a permitted glance without description, the very one they had tried to push into the text yesterday. His hand fell on the lid. The key remained on the hook, but the lid lifted just enough to allow him to remove a thin bundle of payment records for 2 orders. The next morning, the craftswoman, having calculated the stitches of receipts, noticed the disappearance and did not go to the neighboring house to explain in a friendly manner. She brought a note to the office, complained formally, and at her request, the guild took the remaining cards in a sealed envelope. The guards came and sealed the chest with a second seal so that no one could play innocent curiosity before the investigation. By noon, the pawnshop had received a notice with a list of items prohibited from acceptance, and the credit department had received a note about the possible blocking of the family's access to preferential transactions for 1 season if the violation was confirmed. The day passed quietly, but with movement in the registers. An invisible wall was growing at every turn. The investigation took exactly as long as the city needed to prevent the case from turning into soapsuds. The Watchmen's Guild checked the guard's notes and confirmed the cousin's evening visit. The weights and measures guild recorded the loss of 2 cards based on a copy of the inventory. The guild confirmed receipt of the remaining records and listed the debtors whose names had disappeared from the notebooks. The pawnshop showed a refusal to accept the small change from a person without the right of disposal. The sanitary office noted that no one had touched the care kit. The picture formed a table. There had been interference, the objects of labor had been touched, and there had been no access by consent. The penalty was imposed without any friendly discounts. The amount was written out in full, the deadline was immediate, plus a temporary restriction on the offender's family's participation in quarterly auctions and a deferred right to credit until the end of the season. A thin line appeared in the credit register opposite the surname, not a mark of shame, but an accounting barrier. For a house accustomed to family agreements, this line proved to be the most painful. Gifts at feasts are enough for the evening, but access to the market feeds the whole winter. At the same time, the Curia did what it had been studying for many years. It turned a single case into a strengthening of the structure. In the fields of the marriage certificates to be concluded in the coming weeks, a short line was included about a mirrored entry with an inventory, as a mandatory action with an indication of weight and condition. The Watchmen's Association sent out a memo to the neighborhoods about the right to immediate printing in case of a complaint. The Bookbinders Guild introduced a standard cover package for temporary storage of record cards with a double seal. The Brotherhood of Measures updated the small table for kiosks and shops so that trifles could no longer play hide and seek. No particular drama. Instead of loud proclamations, the text was thickened to a thickness that was difficult to tear with your fingers. A few weeks later, the city underwent another inspection, this time from the side of misfortune, under which petty thefts are so often hidden. Late in the evening, a fire broke out in the far row. Thick smoke spread through the attics. The fire engulfed the roofs, and the neighborhood became noisy. A sergeant and his assistant burst into the craftswoman's house. The box's cord was sealed. The box was tied with a second seal, taken out into the yard, and a note about the transfer was made right there under a lamppost with a list of what was inside and a note of the weight of the coral thread and bone comb. The neighbors saw only the movement of hands and the glare of wax. No one saw the panicked look of the relatives toward the chest. The fire was put out, the house stood, the chest returned to the shelf, and the record of the emergency was entered into the book. And again, there was no song, there was procedure. In those very days when tradition likes to ask for leniency, paper showed that it can breathe with misfortune without giving away what does not belong to it. The groom's family initially tried to play the old game. A rumor spread in the market, promising to tell everyone that reservations were alien and spoiled relationships. But the sign of dignified refusal hung in the town hall with the measures and weights, and the shops, where they count rather than sing, reacted to the deadlock in the same way. They postponed credit, asked for prepayment, and looked at the register of fines. Legends don't sell well where numbers are written in words and where everyone understands how often trifles break the spines of books. The clan fell silent. One season without preferential grain purchases is more expensive than any toast. Meanwhile, the city worked out mechanisms that are dryly described in the chronicles, but remembered with gratitude in people's homes. The paramedics' report landed on the office table. Nighttime councils under the windows had decreased in the neighborhood. Complaints about recalculation of goods had fallen, and cases of insomnia and fainting among women-running households had decreased. Among watchmen, the warnings column was empty. These figures do not elicit applause, but it was for their sake that all the cords and seals were made. Where the journals are empty, the storerooms are usually full. When the season turned cold, the craftswoman brought 2 bindings to the guild. A new register for the salt shop, clean, thick with neat columns, and a thin spiritual book, restored from the fragments of an old spine. The guild elder, filing away the receipt for his relative's previous intervention, ran his finger over the spine and nodded without a word. In a city where spines hold sheets, people love such gestures more than words. In the craftswoman's box lay the same simple things: a comb, threads, letters, an icon, coins from her earnings, clean needles, a small glass jar of tincture. To these was added a piece of paper, a copy of the inventory with description, in case consent was ever needed for a common need. The key hung in a specific place. The duplicate was with the guarantor. The seal matched the mark on the sheet. All this rough geometry provided the very smoothness that people who had survived hunger and fever loved. A month before the holidays, rumors began to spread among the neighboring houses that it used to be easier. Those rumors wove together the names of rulers, years when there was not enough salt, seasons when ships carrying grain ran aground. But in the town hall, next to the stand with measures and weights, there was now another table, a short memo titled Myth and Document. It contained no moralizing, only contrasts. All the husbands. Next to it, property regimes. Permitted view. Next to it, inventory as an action. gift instead of a fine. Next to it, the frequency of repeat offenses. Foreign fashion. Next to it, the groom's aunt's letter. Ritual belonging. Next to it, the rule of early registration of the ritual. Common need. Next to it, a sanitary list of personal care. Family honor. Next to it, access to loans and auctions in case of violation. The summary resembled not a poster, but a carpenter's checklist, a tool to keep the house from falling apart at the seams. Each item was attached to the case with page numbers and seals, like nails, and it was these nails that made adult life louder than arguments. The finale did not happen with fanfare. It came together on its own from human decisions, each of which followed a path laid out with reservations. The master kept accounting cards without omissions. The guild kept a ready-made package in case the house fell apart. The guards stamped as soon as they heard the word interference. The shops turned away those who tried to cash in small change without a note from the owner. The credit line evenly reduced the privileges of violators and returned them after the expiration date. The groom's family, having calmed down after a season of sanctions, stopped sending messengers and came to a conclusion that is often repeated in this city. It is cheaper to obey the rules than to explain them to your neighbors. The internal, hidden kinship with one's own document proved to be stronger than the noise in the market. Looking at this story from a distance, it is simple. A small box with a comb, letters, threads, and coins became a battlefield between habit and paperwork. Habit was based on stories about the ancient, threats to cool the feast, attempts to replace the fine with a gift, a permitted glance without an inventory, and ritualistic reservations after the fact. The form responded with lists, seals, weights, fines without a first time, the right of guards to immediate sealing, guild storage of cards, sanitary lists, credit restrictions, and a register of worthy refusals. In the middle between them stood adults, a craftswoman, a guarantor, a foreman, a sergeant, a paramedic, an archivist. They did not utter grand words. They filled in the empty columns. That is why the myth did not die out in the end, but was put on the shelf, like an old but sometimes useful object. It is remembered on holidays, decorating toasts, but not used when it comes to keys, lids, and lists. The documents did not abolish customs. They just took away their teeth. And the box remained what it should be in a city where winter is counted in advance, a quiet reserve, a boundary of respect, and a ruler by which one can evenly measure where ours ends and mine begins. This was the denouement, not as the victory of one family over another, but as the choice of a common way of life without nighttime screams at the door and without a stranger's hand on your child.